In this lecture, we're going to have a closer look at the this keyword in JavaScript. So I'm going to start by declaring a constructor function called circle. And in this constructor function, I'm going to set this.draw to a function. We simply do a console.log of this. Now we create a circle object. So constant C, we set it to a new circle, and then call c.draw. Now, when I save the changes on the console, you're going to see our circle object because this will point to that circle object. So let's see, save the changes, and here is our circle object, right? Now let me show you something interesting. Instead of calling this draw method like this, I'm going to get a reference to this method, store it in this constant called draw, so c.draw. Note that I'm not calling this method. I'm simply getting a reference to this method. So if we do a console.log of draw, we're going to see this function. Let's take a look. Save the changes, and here's our draw function, right? Now, I'm going to call this draw function like this. Now, when I save the changes, instead of seeing the circle object, you're going to see the window object. Let me show you. So save, and here's our window object. But what happened here? Why didn't we get the circle object? Okay, let me tell you why. First of all, this syntax we have on line 7 is what we call method call. Because we're calling a method on an object, right? In this case, this in this function will point to this object, which is our circle object, right? Now, the syntax we have on line 11 is what we call function call. Because we're calling this like a standalone function that is not part of an object. So when we call this method as a function, by default, this will point to the global object, which is window in the browser and global in Node. Now to refresh your memory, earlier in the course, I told you that here when we use the new operator, this new operator will create a new empty object and set this in this constructor function to point to that object. And I also told you that if you forget to use the new operator, this by default will point to the global object, which is window in the browser or global in Node. We have exactly the same principle here. So when we call draw as a method on an object, this will point to that object. And if we call this method as a standalone function, this will point to the global object. Now, in JavaScript, we have this mode that is called strict mode. When we enable this mode, JavaScript engine will be more sensitive. So it will do more error checking. If there are errors that silently fail, it's going to turn them into exceptions. And also it will change the behavior of this keyword in functions. So we can enable the strict mode by adding this string on the top, use strict. Now, when I save the changes, you will see that instead of getting the window object here, we'll get undefined. So save, here it is, undefined. So when we enable strict mode, if we call a method as a function, this by default will no longer point to the global object, it will be set to undefined. And the reason for this is to prevent us from accidentally modifying the global object, because that's bad practice. Now there's more to this strict mode that is beyond the scope of this course, but let's see how this keyword behaves in our ES6 classes. So I'm going to delete all this code and define a circle class. Here we add the draw method and do a console.log of this. Now we create an object, circle, get a reference to the draw method, so c.draw, and then call it like a function. What do you think we're going to see? Let's have a look. Save the changes, we get undefined. Because by default, the body of our classes are executed in the strict mode. So whether we explicitly enable the strict mode on top of this file or not, JavaScript engine will execute the body of this class in the strict mode. And this will prevent us from accidentally modifying the global object.